You were born in undisclosed place. Not in a palace, nor on a battlefield. No golden cradle. No mother who would be remembered. No parchment records. You arrive softly, like a breeze stirring old ash. The world you enter is already weary, sun-bleached stones, tired temples, land cracked with forgotten names. You do not cry. You listen. The people around you speak little, but the silence says more. A silence heavy with memory, as if the ground itself is holding its breath. You grow in this hush. The world does not rush you. And so, you learn slowly. You learn deeply. You learn to listen so carefully that you can hear what even the wind has given up trying to carry. There is no ink. No alphabet for you yet. Everything worth remembering must be kept alive through breath. And breath is fragile. One death, one fever, one war, and an entire world disappears. But not with you. With you, the words cling. They burrow behind your ribs. They nest behind your eyes. You remember stories that were never yours. You are not called Homer, not yet. You have no name, not in the way names are known now. Names, after all, belong to people. But you are becoming something else. A vessel. A pattern. A keeper of voices not your own. They say you are blind. But you don't know what that means. You see things others do not. You see time bending like reeds in the river. You see sorrow dancing behind smiles. You see gods walking in the shadows of men. And you hear, oh, how you hear. You hear what the earth mutters when no one is listening. You live among ruins. And you love them. Not for what they are, but for what they were. You place your fingers on broken stone and feel the echo of laughter, of prayers, of cries that rose during sieges and silenced at dawn. To others, a toppled column is just that, a fall. To you, it is a doorway. The elders speak of wars. Not as strategy, not as history, but as dreams too sharp to hold. They speak of a city that burned so long ago, no one is certain it existed. But the pain in their voice makes it real. They speak of gods who took sides. Of mortals who defied them. Of a horse made of wood, and a fire made of grief. You don't know where the city is. You don't need to. It is already inside you. You start to repeat their stories, first in whispers, then in rhythm. The rhythm comes naturally, like breath. You don't just repeat what they said, you rearrange it. You polish it like a stone in the tide. Your voice turns their fragments into form. The people listen. Even those who claim they don't believe. You are still young when someone weeping in the dark reaches for you, not for comfort, but for words. They do not want truth. They want meaning. They want shape. They want a way to live with the things they cannot change. And you give it to them, not from knowledge, but from the strange place inside you where images arrive uninvited. And now they begin to call you Homer. No one agrees what it means. Some say hostage. Some say blind. Some say it is just a sound made to explain the impossible. You do not correct them. You wear it lightly, like a shadow that has chosen to follow. You speak of kings who weep. Of warriors who disobey. Of gods who lose their temper. You do not flatter them. You do not write for power. You speak for those whose voices were drowned by waves or cut short by spears. You speak so they are not swallowed by forgetting. One night, you walk alone through olive groves that stretch into forever. The stars are singing, or maybe it's just the wind. And you feel it, that you are not merely speaking stories. You are becoming them. You are the place where the forgotten gather. The voice in the dust. You close your eyes and see flames, ancient cities aflame again. Faces lit by firelight, twisted in hope and regret. Ships sailing into storms. Men arguing with gods. Wives waiting by empty shores. And in the center of it all, silence. That's where you live now. In that silence. In that breath between what was and what must not be lost. You are not alone. There are others like you. In other lands. In other tongues. Some speak in riddles. Some chant. Some carve. All of you are trying to hold something together with words, something older than your nations, your temples, your time. You meet a boy who asks if the things you sing are true. You smile. You tell him truth is not always in what happened, but in what must be remembered. He does not understand, but he will. One day, someone will ask him the same thing. You sing by the sea. You sing in markets. You sing in halls where warlords sharpen their pride and hide their wounds. They pretend not to weep. You pretend not to notice. You never accuse. You never beg. You only remind. That is your task. To remind. The world begins to change. You can feel it, like the air before a storm. New powers rise. Old shrines crumble. But still, they listen. They may forget your face. They may forget your name. But they remember the rhythm. The breath. The blood behind the words. And that is enough. You have begun. The voice has found its form. The dust has remembered how to sing. You wake before the birds. There is no rooster. No bell. No signal to mark the beginning of your day. The world stirs quietly, like an old animal stretching in its den. You rise not because of duty, but because the silence has a pull. You follow it. You always have. Outside, the earth is still dark, but the horizon glows faintly, like breath behind fabric. You walk barefoot across cold stone. In the distance, smoke curls from a village hearth. Somewhere, someone stirs lentils. Somewhere else, a child hums to herself, not knowing her song is older than her tongue. This is a world without books. There is no parchment, no scroll, no alphabet carved in clean symmetry. Nothing to catch language and keep it. Everything that matters must be remembered, and everything remembered must be spoken. The mouth is the only library. The mind, the only paper. And so, you learn. Not from lessons, but from rhythm. You learn to count not with numbers but with steps, how many from tree to stream. How many heartbeats in a storm. You remember through movement. Through voice. Through breath. The old men sit beneath olive trees and repeat the same stories, not because they have nothing new to say, but because the act of repetition is sacred. Each retelling is not a copy, it is a ritual, a rebirth. You sit beside them, not interrupting. You listen. You let their voices shape your world. No two versions are the same. One says the hero's shield was bronze. Another says it bore a lion, then a storm, then the night sky. You do not correct. You collect. Truth in this world is not fixed, it is fluid. Carried like water from one vessel to another. Some of it spills. Some of it is sweetened. Some of it turns bitter. All of it is alive. You walk with traders from the coast. Their mouths are full of names you've never heard: Tyre, Sidon, Thebes, Babylon. They speak of gods with bird heads and pyramids that touch the stars. They tell you about deserts where the sand sings. And you remember. Not because you've seen these places, but because the stories spark something ancient in you, as if you've known them long before this life. One day, a traveler shows you a tablet. Clay, marked with scratches. He calls it writing. He tells you it holds words that never fade. He says it will replace memory. You hold it, but it feels cold. Dead. Like a hand severed from its owner. You nod politely. But in your chest, you mourn something that hasn't yet died. You speak not for permanence, but for presence. Your voice belongs to the moment. To the fire, to the breath of the listener. If no one hears you, the story sleeps. If they do, it lives again. There is magic in that fragility. The children gather at dusk. They laugh and mimic your phrases. They argue about what the gods said, who stabbed whom, which beast had how many heads. You watch them recreate what you shaped, reshaped from what you gathered. And you realize, you are not the end of anything. You are the middle. A thread in a cloth too vast to see. Your stories are not yours. They belong to those who listen. They shift in each ear, blossom in each mind. A boy hears them and dreams of spears. A girl hears them and dreams of ships. An old man hears them and weeps for a brother he lost before his beard grew in. You are many things to many people. And yet, no one truly knows you. But you don't need to be known. Not in that way. What you carry is heavier than ego. It is older than pride. It is the ache of being human, handed down like a torch in a storm. You hold it, but you did not light it. And you know, you will not be the last. You sleep outside more often now. Not because you are poor, but because the sky comforts you. The stars above remind you of the spaces between words. Of the silences that make music possible. You trace constellations with your finger and imagine each one a story lost to time. Then you promise, you will keep losing none of them, if you can help it. Someone asks you, once, how you remember so much. You tell them you don't. The stories remember themselves, they just use you to speak. This makes them laugh. But you weren't joking. There are no monuments to you. No statues. No lineage. You are not a king or priest. You are not a soldier or merchant. You are only a voice. And in this world, that is both everything and nothing. Sometimes, the silence scares you. You worry the stories might leave. That you'll wake up one day and they'll be gone, emptied from your mind like water from a cracked jar. You pray, not to the gods of Olympus, but to the nameless spirit of memory itself. You offer no sacrifice. Only breath. And the stories stay. They come when you're sick. When you're lonely. When you're surrounded. When you are standing in line for grain. They whisper themselves to you in pieces. Like waves. Like dreams. Like ancestors who cannot rest until they are heard again. One morning, a storm takes down a tree you used to sit beneath. The villagers mourn it like a friend. You sit beside its fallen trunk and begin a new tale. One you've never told before. About a man with no sight, who sees the world through other people's sorrow. About a poet who remembers things even the gods have forgotten. You tell it slowly. Each word like a stone laid carefully in the foundation of a house that may never be built. No one interrupts. No one breathes too loud. When it ends, the silence stretches, not empty, but full. You look up. And in their eyes, you see it. They do not remember your name. But they will remember your voice. The sky is ink now. Deep, warm, ancient. A slow hush settles over the land like a blanket pulled over a restless child. The fields are quiet. The animals stilled. The gods, if they watch, do so from behind the stars. You sit by the fire. Not alone. Never alone. There are always others. Faces half-lit, eyes flickering like candle flames. They gather close, not for warmth, but for the spell. The spell of a story. A rhythm that turns night into memory. You sit cross-legged, elbows on knees, and breathe. No one announces it. No drum roll. No curtain. The telling simply begins. Long ago. That is enough. The words come. The people follow. They lean forward. They close their eyes. Their minds reach through your words, grasping for forms, for faces, for feelings not their own but deeply familiar. You do not just speak, you summon. You call forth heroes. You awaken monsters. You unfold tragedies as gently as linen, and everyone leans into the unraveling. The fire crackles, like it, too, is listening. Sparks rise like prayers. Ash dances upward. The shadows behind you stretch and twitch, mimicking the movements of your tale. Sometimes, they seem to move before you speak. As if they know what's coming. This is where stories are born, not on stone, not in ink, but in flame. Around it. Because of it. The fire is a heartbeat, a companion. It flickers as your voice rises, softens when you pause. It does not judge. It only holds the space. You speak of things they've heard before, but never quite like this. Because each night is different. Each listener breathes differently. Each silence between your words shapes the tale anew. That is the magic. Not the tale itself, but the telling. The now of it. The pulse of language wrapped in smoke. You begin to notice how stories change depending on where you are. In the mountains, the winds become spirits. In the coastlands, the sea is both mother and monster. In the forests, trees whisper secrets to those who dare to ask. You do not invent these things. You listen to the land, then speak what it wishes remembered. A girl sits across from you, legs tucked under her, braids catching sparks of orange light. Her mouth is slightly open. Not to speak. Just to receive. You say a name, an old one, older than the gods of the temples, and her eyes widen. She does not know why. She has never heard it before. And yet it moves something in her. Something buried. That is how stories work. They are keys to doors inside people they did not know they had. And here, in this moment, you realize, you are not a creator. You are a bridge. You are the gap between forgetting and remembrance. The thread between the dead and the unborn. You do not own the tale. You carry it. Like a torch passed through generations. And one day, someone else will carry it from you. You wonder sometimes what makes a story last. Why some vanish while others echo through centuries. You suspect it has nothing to do with heroes or battles or clever tricks. You suspect it has to do with need. The need to explain, to mourn, to celebrate, to belong. Stories that meet that need survive. Those that don't, fade. A man in the crowd speaks up. Interrupts. That's not how I heard it, he says. And you smile. Not insulted. Delighted. He has remembered a different version. This means the story is alive. You let him tell it. Then you gather his words, reshape them, and by the end of the night, both versions have merged. Now they are one. Now they will travel further. Sometimes, you forget your own lines. A name. A city. The exact number of ships. But no one notices. Or if they do, they forgive. because they are not listening for accuracy. They are listening for truth. The kind that lives beneath facts. The kind that breathes. You speak of gods, not as marble statues or temple-bound tyrants, but as feelings, as forces. Rage becomes Ares. Longing becomes Aphrodite. Wisdom becomes Athena. You give shape to what cannot be touched. And in doing so, the people understand themselves more clearly. They do not need theology. They need reflection. And your words are a mirror. One night, a storm interrupts your story. Thunder rolls over the hills like a warning. The fire sputters, rain begins to hiss down. But no one moves. They pull their cloaks tighter and sit closer. And in the half-dark, half-cold, you raise your voice. Not shouting, just steady. Strong. And you continue. That is when you understand the full weight of what you do. You are not just passing time. You are protecting something fragile. Something sacred. Something easily drowned. You finish your story soaked, your hands trembling from the cold. But their eyes, wide, grateful, awake, are the warmth you need. They do not clap. They do not cheer. They simply nod. As if to say, we will remember this. And they do. Days pass. Then weeks. In a distant village, someone repeats your story. Not word for word, but in spirit. They add something new. They forget something old. But the fire still burns. And in that fire, you live. You begin to travel more. Not to spread your name. Your name is unimportant. But the stories, they must move. They must survive. So you walk. From coast to island. From hill to plain. You speak in markets, in shepherd huts, in palaces where your voice echoes across marble. Everywhere, the same thing, faces around firelight, waiting to remember something they did not know they had forgotten. You speak not to impress. Not to control. Not to preach. You speak to keep the flame alive. The sea is not a place, it is a voice. You walk beside it often now. Not to reach a destination, but to listen. It murmurs, roars, whispers, screams. Sometimes it sings lullabies in tongues no one remembers. Other times it shouts warnings no one understands. But always, it speaks. And always, you listen. The shore is your classroom. Waves roll in like thoughts returning. Shells litter the sand like discarded words. Driftwood arrives from places you've never seen, telling stories with salt-stained silence. Each tide brings offerings, and you accept them with reverence. Not everything must be spoken. Some stories enter through the skin. You learn to recognize the moods of the sea. How it grumbles when the moon pulls too hard. How it smiles in the morning mist. How it can vanish into glass, then shatter into rage. No god you've ever sung of is more honest than the ocean. It wants nothing from you but your respect. One day, a storm comes, not just of wind, but of fate. You are on the edge of a fishing village, where men pray to Poseidon without knowing why. The sky darkens. Boats groan against their moorings. Women gather baskets they will not use. The air becomes heavy with waiting. And then it breaks. The storm strikes like a sudden grief. Not with warning, but with certainty. Thunder rolls over the hills, deeper than drums, more ancient than anger. Rain slashes sideways, cutting through roofs, thoughts, and breath. The sea rises, not to meet the sky, but to defy it. You do not run. You crouch beneath a rock ledge and listen. To the gods. To the wind. to the fear in men's voices and the calm in the sea's fury. And there, in the chaos, you begin to hum. A melody finds you. You don't own it. It simply enters. Like a lost child returning. The storm does not quiet, but within it, your story begins. You sing of a stranger who sailed into a storm and came out changed. Not stronger, not wiser, just different. Softer where he was once sharp. Sharper where he was once soft. The villagers gather, soaked and shivering, to hear you. Not for distraction, but for orientation. Your words are a compass when maps are useless. The stranger in your tale does not fight the sea. He does not beg the gods. He surrenders to the water, not to drown, but to be carried. He lets go of oars, of pride, of plans. And he survives. Not because he was brave, but because he listened. The storm ends. The next morning, the village is scarred. Nets torn, roofs caved, goats missing. But no one speaks of the damage. They speak of the stranger. Of the men who survived by letting go. A boy carves his image into driftwood. An elder repeats your phrases as if they were scripture. And just like that, the story begins to float. It leaves the village before you do. You hear it again in another town, changed, adorned with new names and better rhymes. The stranger now has a golden scar. A wife waiting in a tower. A secret whispered by a dying sailor. None of this was in your telling. But none of it is wrong. Stories are like ships. Once released, they find their own wind. You continue your walk. Coastlines become pathways. Islands become punctuation marks in your journey. You eat dates in Cyprus, figs in Delos, bread in Crete. Always listening. Always storing. Not collecting souvenirs, but impressions. Tastes. Colors. Songs sung by women grinding grain. Curses shouted by men hauling nets. Laughter under starlight that sounds like home even when it isn't. And in every port, you hear echoes of yourself. The words are different. The rhythm has shifted. But the pulse, the pulse is the same. You have become the stranger. And you have become the sea. In a quiet harbor, you meet an old woman who tells you of a god who fell in love with a mortal. She whispers it like a sin. He came to her as a wave, she says. Left her with a child and foam in her hair. You do not ask for more. You simply bow, and that night, the god and the mortal become verses in your next tale. You start to see stories as living things. Not just in mouths, but in places. A cave holds a myth. A cliff hums with legend. The sea itself carries sagas no one has dared to tell. And you, walking barefoot on sand, feel more like a midwife than a bard. You do not create. You deliver. At night, you dream of drowning, not in water, but in voices. Ancient voices, wordless voices, some weeping, some laughing, all pressing in, asking to be remembered. You wake breathless, and begin to speak. The only way to breathe again is to let the words out. The sea gives. The sea takes. And stories are what remain when everything else is washed away. One twilight, you see a boy standing ankle-deep in the surf. He is tossing stones, not out of anger, but rhythm. He counts his throws, like prayers. You ask his name, but he doesn't answer. He just turns and says, "Tell me about the men who returned home." You do. Not because he asked, but because it was time. And as your voice rises over the waves, you feel the wind shift, not around you, but inside you. The tide has turned. A new chapter begins. You are sitting with a man who has not spoken in 3 days. He stares at the horizon like it betrayed him. His food sits untouched. His hands are wrapped in cloth, stained with something darker than blood. Around him, people carry on, mending nets, tending goats, arguing over grain. But he is still. Like a statue no one dares move. They say he lost his brother in a raid. They say he killed 3 men in return. They say the gods demanded silence from him, and now he obeys. But you do not ask. You only sit nearby. And wait. On the 4th day, he whispers, "Tell me why pain has a name." You say nothing for a long time. Then you begin. You tell of a god who was once a man. A man who suffered so deeply that the world mistook him for divine. His grief carved mountains. His rage turned forests to ash. He walked the earth not to rule, but to find someone who could understand his wound. And when he failed, he became immortal, not in joy, but in resignation. The silent man listens. His fingers twitch. His eyes close. When you finish, he stands and walks away. But that night, someone else repeats the tale. Louder. Sharper. With a different ending. A wound, it seems, is not the end of the story, it is its beginning. You start to notice how every scar in this world is covered in myth. A missing arm becomes a prophecy. A crooked leg, a blessing from a jealous god. A burn on the face, proof that the bearer survived a dragon's breath. Or lightning. Or love. The truth doesn't matter as much as the shape the story gives to the ache. Pain is shapeless. Memory is cruel. But myth is orderly. It makes the unbearable bearable. The random, divine. You meet a girl with no voice. Her throat scarred, her words stolen in a fever. But she hums. Always humming. Tunes that rise and fall like waves. Her father says she was touched by a muse. Her mother says it was punishment for a lie. You don't argue. You hum back. And between you, a new story begins. One made of music, not speech. You speak to warriors whose eyes have never seen battle. To widows who dream of husbands as wolves. To farmers who claim their crops grow only because they once kissed a goddess. Everyone carries a wound. And everyone wraps it in legend. You begin to wonder if the gods came after the pain, or before it. Perhaps mortals needed gods not for guidance, but for explanation. Perhaps they looked at their bruises, their losses, the empty cradles and broken gates, and said, "This must mean something." And so they named the ache. They crowned it. They painted it gold and called it divine. You walk through a village built entirely of ash. Charred beams. Collapsed stones. Blackened olive trees. A single family remains. An old woman stirs soup in silence. When you ask what happened, she says only, "A god tested us." You ask which one. She smiles, toothless and tired. Whichever one needed to hear us scream. And then she offers you soup. You drink. The taste is bitter. But warming. You realize that wounds are not just personal, they are communal. One man's grief becomes a family's ritual. One woman's heartbreak becomes a shrine. The gods are made not in temples, but in absence. In the hollow left behind by what cannot be fixed. You begin to collect these god wounds like prayers. Not to keep, but to carry until they find the right mouth to speak them again. You tell of a boy who stabbed his own foot to avoid war. And how the gods, impressed by his cunning pain, gave him a new path, one of stories, not swords. You sing it in a crowded market. A young man weeps into his coins. Later, You hear him telling the same tale to a child who limps. You start to see your role more clearly now. You are not a comfort. You are not a cure. You are the mirror in which pain becomes bearable, because it is no longer nameless. You do not judge. You do not heal. But you remind people that their suffering belongs to something bigger. Something older. Something shared. One night, by a crumbling shrine, you lie down beneath the stars and ask the silence, "Will anyone ever tell a story about me?" The wind does not answer. But in your heart, a voice not your own replies. They already are. You stand before a fire. Not one that warms or cooks. This fire is memory. It does not consume wood, it consumes silence. It is fed by the need to remember. And you feed it with a name, Troy. No one agrees where Troy is. Some say it was across the sea, on a hill where roses now grow. Others insist it was never real, only a metaphor, a lesson carved into dream. But it does not matter. The name burns regardless. It burns in songs, in curses, in lullabies. Troy is not a place. Troy is a pattern. And you know the pattern by heart. It begins with pride. A wedding. A golden apple. A quarrel among gods. A shepherd prince and a stolen queen. A fleet of ships so vast the sea itself recoiled. 10 years of war. And a wooden shape full of silence. Then fire. You tell this story not once, but hundreds of times. And each time it shifts. Each time it sharpens. The faces change. The gods become quieter. The grief becomes louder. But the shape remains. A city. A desire. A betrayal. A fire. People ask you why this story matters. Why sing of a war long finished? Why mourn a city no map can find? Why honor kings whose thrones are dust? You look into their eyes and see it. Troy is still burning. It burns in the boy who cannot forgive his father. In the woman who loved someone she shouldn't. In the leader who sends others to die and calls it fate. In the silence after every scream that went unheard. You meet a soldier with a broken jaw. He cannot speak, but he draws pictures in the dirt, of helmets, of horses, of hollow things. He listens as you tell of Achilles dragging a body behind his chariot. The soldier does not flinch. He simply nods. And when you're done, he adds another drawing, a burning gate. You understand. He's seen his own Troy. In a crowded port, a merchant interrupts you. Says your story is wrong. That the queen was not stolen, she left willingly. That the war was not about honor but greed. That no god cared. Only men did. You do not argue. You listen. And the next time you tell the story, it includes both versions. The stolen queen and the willing runaway. The noble cause and the selfish conquest. The gods above and the silence below. Because truth is not a single thread, it's a tapestry. Torn, patched, and rewoven by every voice that dares to touch it. You begin to feel the weight of Troy in your bones. Not as sorrow, but as inheritance. This is the tale you were born to carry. Not because it is yours, but because no one owns it. It belongs to the fire. And the fire asks for it again and again. You notice children reenacting it in the dust. One plays Achilles. Another Hector. A girl pretends to be Helen, standing on a stone wall, her arms outstretched to no one. They don't know the details. But they know the shape. Already, the war has found them. One evening, by the sea, an old man tells you of a siege that happened in his youth. He speaks not of glory, but of hunger. Of eating rats. Of praying to a god whose name he's forgotten. He says, "There's no poetry in war, boy." You nod. And then, gently, you begin your story. He listens. And when you reach the end, when the city burns, he closes his eyes. Not in disagreement, but in surrender. Because even the truth needs a rhythm. Even pain needs a melody. You dream of Troy often now. But the faces shift. Sometimes it is a walled city of bronze. Sometimes it is your village. Sometimes it is your own heart, burning behind ribs like ruined gates. You wake with ash in your mouth and a story on your lips. You tell it again. Not because you must, but because it will not let you go. And across the world, where you'll never walk, someone else lights a fire. And speak your words. It begins with silence. Not peace. Not mercy. Silence born of waiting. Of breath held beneath a city's skin. You speak the name, Odysseus, and the air itself tightens. They call him many things. Cunning. Coward. Genius. Liar. Hero. It doesn't matter. What matters is that he knew, war does not end with strength. It ends with deception. You tell of the wooden horse. A gift. A trick. A doorway carved from trust and pride. You describe how the Greeks pretended to retreat, burning their camps, scattering ashes to the wind. How they left behind this strange offering, so large it had to be dragged. So beautiful it demanded belief. And the Trojans, oh, how they debated. You make the listeners feel the tension, priests warning, children marveling, soldiers itching for peace. One man says burn it. Another says bring it inside. You speak the words with a slow rhythm, like footsteps approaching something unseen. Eventually, they choose beauty. They always do. And so the horse enters the city. Pulled through broken gates. Paraded like a trophy. A godless miracle. The people drink, dance, dream. They believe it is over. But war does not end when men stop fighting, it ends when they stop questioning. You lower your voice when you speak of the night. The stars bright. The city quiet. The gates locked. And from within the belly of the beast, movement. A hinge. A whisper. A breath. Then warriors spilling into streets like shadows. You do not sing this part with joy. You sing it like mourning. Like memory forced to wear a mask. The gates open. The army returns. The fire begins again. Troy falls not to strength, but to faith. That is the cruelty of the story. That the end came not by spear or sword, but by trust misused. By cleverness with no conscience. By the shape of a gift that was never meant to be opened. Your listeners go quiet when you reach this part. No one speaks. Because they know the shape of the horse. They've seen it in their own lives. A promise too perfect. A stranger too kind. A solution too sudden. They remember the times they let something in, only to find ruin waiting inside. You once told this story to a child who refused to believe it. He shook his head. No one would fall for that. You smiled, but said nothing. Years later, you found him again, older, quieter, scarred in ways that had no name. He did not speak. He only nodded. And you knew he had met his own wooden horse. One evening, you meet a woman who says she has heard the story many times, but always with a different ending. In her version, Helen sets fire to the horse herself. In another, Odysseus is cursed to dream of screaming children for the rest of his life. In another still, the gods weep, not for Troy, but for their own cruelty. You listen. You remember. And next time, you include her versions too. Because the fall of Troy was never one tale, it was 1,000 betrayals wrapped in the skin of one. You realize that this is why the story survives. Not because it is noble, but because it is true. Because the world is full of horses with hollow hearts. Because trust is fragile. And brilliance, when misused, burns brighter than any torch. You sit alone after telling it, staring at your own campfire. You wonder, if someone offered you a way to end war, not with honor, but with trickery, would you take it? You think of the boy who didn't believe. Of the men who did. And then you whisper into the flames. The line between wisdom and betrayal is drawn by the victor. The fire answers with a crack, and a gust of wind scatters sparks into the dark. You walk beside a ghost. Not dead. Not entirely. But changed. Hollowed by distance. Shaped by years like cliffs carved by wind. His name shifts depending on who speaks it, Odysseus, the cunning one, the lost king, the wanderer. But to you, he is simply the man who did not arrive when expected. You tell his story slowly. Not as a hero's triumph, but as a question whispered over time. What does it mean to go home? He leaves Troy, weary but alive. His men cheer, their sails full, their hearts light. But the gods are not done playing. And the sea is never straight. Islands rise like riddles. Winds shift like moods. And one by one, everything he knows is taken. You walk with him to the land of the lotus eaters, where forgetting tastes sweet and time sleeps. You feel the pull of it, how tempting it is to forget why you began. But he resists. He ties his men to the mast of memory and sails on. You follow him into caves where monsters sleep beside their sheep. You smell the sour breath of Polyphemus, the one-eyed hunger of nature unshaped by civilization. You hear the crunch of bones. You see the cleverness it takes to escape, not with sword, but with name. You ride the winds he was gifted, Aeolus's pouch of storms. A careless opening. A home almost reached, then snatched away again. You drift with him to Circe, the witch who turns men into pigs, but speaks like someone who's just tired of being alone. You see how he stays longer than he says. You see the part of him that wonders if maybe this is close enough to home. But still he leaves. Always leaving. You descend with him into the underworld. The air cold, the voices colder. You meet his mother. She doesn't blame him. She just wants to touch his face again. And when he tries, she slips through his hands like smoke. You see him weep then. Not for what he's lost, but for the men he used to be. You ride the waves with him past sirens, whose songs promise answers no man survives long enough to understand. You hear them too, and for a moment, you wish you hadn't. Because their song is beautiful in a way that wounds. And still, he sails on. Not because he's strong, but because home is not a place, it's a tether. Each island he leaves is a life he could have lived. A wife who isn't his. A paradise that costs his name. A version of himself with no story. He walks away from each, not because he's certain, but because doubt keeps him moving. You see him finally reach shore. Ithaca. But he does not run to his wife. He hides. He watches. He tests. After years of longing, he hesitates. Because sometimes the journey changes you so much, you're afraid to be recognized. He returns not with thunder, but with silence. A beggar in his own halls. An arrow hidden beneath rags. You tell of Penelope, too. Not as an accessory, but as a map. the one who waited, who weaved and unweaved, who endured the slow violence of hope. Her name is not sung loud, but it hums behind every line. When they meet again, it is not passion. It is recognition. It is two ghosts realizing they are still alive. And still willing. You finish the story, and someone asks, why didn't the gods make it easier for him? You reply, because easy stories don't last. You think of all the people who've walked long roads. Not with ships, but with shame. With grief. With guilt. You think of the father who returns to a child too old to know him. The woman who comes home to find the door locked from the inside. The prisoner who forgot what his home looked like. Their names are not Odysseus. But their pain rhymes with his. One day, in a coastal village, you hear a girl retelling the tale. But in hers, the journey never ends. He keeps walking past Ithaca. Past memory. Past name. Because sometimes home is not where you arrive, it's what you lose along the way. And you do not correct her. Because perhaps that, too, is true. The story does not need to be finished to be faithful. You look out over the sea. It stretches endlessly. The same sea that took him. That returned him. That still whispers of other shores. And you say his name once more. Not to summon him, but to remind yourself. Some stories return. Some wander forever. And some do both. You begin with the quiet. Not the silence of absence, but the hum of patience. The breath held between wars. The stillness of rooms untouched, beds unmoved, garments folded and refolded while the world forgets their scent. You speak of the women. Not the ones who died in the songs, but the ones who survived them. They ask you, sometimes, where were we? You answer with a story. You tell of Penelope, yes, but not only the loom. You describe her feet pacing the same tile path for 20 years. You describe the ache behind her eyes, the kind that even dreams won't soothe. You speak her name with reverence, not for what she waited for, but for how she waited, weaving not hope, but resistance. She was not frozen. She was working. Unraveling time one night at a time. And then you speak of others. Of the mother who kissed her son goodbye and was told, it'll be quick. 10 years passed, and her tears grew quiet. No tomb. No urn. Just an empty cup she stopped filling. Of the sister who wore his armor once, just to remember his weight. She never spoke of him again, but everyone heard his name in the way she walked. Of the daughter who grew up with stories instead of hands. Whose lullabies were dirges. Whose games reenacted deaths no child should know. They were there. In the background. In the margins. And the margins remember. One night, you sit with an old woman beside a dry well. She tells you of a goddess no temple ever honored, one who waits beneath the earth, brushing the hair of forgotten wives. She says this goddess does not demand sacrifices. Only remembrance. You listen. Then you tell her story forward, and someone in the next village adds flowers to her altar. You realize that waiting is not emptiness. It is labor. It is myth-making in slow motion. It is how songs survive while warriors sleep beneath stones. You tell of Andromache, who lost a husband, a son, a city, and still stood tall enough to mother another land. You describe the way her voice must have sounded, steady as rope pulled taut, binding loss to survival. You do not say she moved on. You say she endured. There is a difference. You remember Cassandra, too. The one cursed to know and not be believed. You wonder if her prophecies were less cruel than the sound of her own voice returning to her unheard. You wonder how many women carry that same curse now, seeing, warning, being dismissed. A girl in the crowd asks if all women in stories must suffer. You pause. Then you say, no. But many do. And they remember longer. You begin collecting their stories like dropped stitches. The bride who wore her wedding dress every year on the day he left, until the fabric fell apart. The mother who raised a monument of bones, not to mourn but to defy forgetting. The widow who wrote names on river stones and threw them back, one each season, until her grief grew wings. You speak of them not as background, but as gravity. The weight that kept men from floating too far into glory. They were the fire that stayed lit when the wind howled. The ones who cooked memory into bread, stirred it into soup, sang it into lullabies. They were the listeners. And listening, too, is a kind of war. You walk now with heavier steps, feeling the presence of women you've never met. Their stories thread through yours like vines through old stone. They do not ask for thanks. Only that you carry them. So you do. You whisper their names before sleep. You speak of their waiting not as passivity, but as defiance. You remind your listeners that not all battles are fought with blades, and not all victories leave bodies behind. Sometimes, they leave women standing where cities used to be. And those women, by sheer will, rebuild what no god thought to preserve. There are things you've never seen. Not the color of a ripe fig. Not the shimmer of sun on bronze. Not the smile that hovers before a lie. Not the shadow a hand casts when raised in love, or rage. They say you are blind. They say it with pity. Sometimes with reverence. Sometimes with fear. As if your darkness lets them project whatever meaning they need onto you. But you do not feel broken. Your sight was traded, long ago, for something deeper. You see in other ways. You hear a man's grief in the way his sandal drags. You feel the heat of jealousy in the way a child's breath quickens. You know who lies by the pause before a word, by the flutter in the throat that betrays the tongue. What you lack in eyes, you find in echoes. You do not see faces, but you see truth. And truth is a strange thing, it shines best in darkness. They ask if you dream. You say yes. You dream in rhythms. In tides of feeling. In shapes made not of form, but of pressure. In memories you never lived but somehow carry. You dream of stories before they're told. One boy asked, if you've never seen a war, how can you describe it? You smiled. And said, I have never seen the wind. But I've heard the screams it leaves behind. He did not ask again. There is power in not seeing. You cannot be seduced by surfaces. You cannot be distracted by gleam or gesture. You move through the world by weight, by presence, by voice. It makes some uneasy. Especially kings. They do not like being seen without their crowns. You've sat beside men who ruled nations, and you've heard the emptiness behind their laughter. You've stood in alleys with beggars whose silence carried more dignity than any gold-fringed robe. Sight may deceive. But you are not deceived. You've become a mirror, one that reflects what others refuse to acknowledge. And they come to you for it. The vision in your darkness. One night, a traveler kneels before you, shaking. He's seen something he cannot forget. Blood. Fire. A friend who turned on him when silver whispered louder than loyalty. He asks you, how do I live with what I saw? You touch his chest and say, you don't. You let it live in you. And then you name it. He stares. You begin to tell a story. Not his. Not exactly. But close enough. A warrior who saw too much. who burned his sword and buried his armor, who learned to carry his pain like a lantern, lighting the path of others who came behind him. By the end, the traveler is crying. Not from sorrow, but relief. Because someone named the thing he carried. And naming, sometimes, is enough. You are not alone in your blindness. There were others, Tiresias, who saw the future with eyes turned inward. Demodocus, who sang of gods while staring at nothing. You do not know if they were real. But you know their voices. You feel them echo in your breath when the story finds its rhythm. Sometimes you wonder, were they blind because they were chosen? Or were they chosen because the gods needed someone who would not look away? You don't dwell on it. You have stories to speak. And each one comes to you not in color or shape, but in feeling. The kind that hums just beneath the ribs. The kind that knows when something is right, even if the world says it isn't. People say you must have suffered, living in darkness. You don't correct them. You just smile. Because they don't know the light that lives in sound. They don't feel how words glow when spoken with care. They don't understand that sometimes, blindness is the only way to see what matters. You hear someone whisper once, "He sees too much." You take it as a compliment. You will never see the flames of Troy, the eyes of Penelope, the golden skin of a god. But you have touched their truth. And that is enough. It begins with a whisper you don't remember making. A child in another village tells your story. But the name is different. The rhythm is off. The hero now rides a black serpent instead of a horse. The goddess no longer weeps, she laughs. You ask who told it to her. She shrugs. Everyone knows that one. You smile. Because this is how it happens. Your voice, carried by wind and hunger, has landed somewhere new, and changed. You move from island to island, and everywhere you go, your words are waiting for you. Bent. Broken. Blooming. You find a boy telling the tale of a king who sailed too far and was turned into a mountain. He says the mountain still weeps in rain. He swears it's true. You recognize the shape of Odysseus in his story. You do not correct him. You let the mountain stand. You sit with an old man in a stone house who sings of Helen, not as a queen, but as a fox who steals fire from men's hearts. In his version, she is not stolen. She is the storm. The cause and cure. The beautiful destruction. You listen. You remember. And you carry it forward. Your voice has become something else. Something bigger than you. It splits like lightning. Each bolt landing in a new soil, sparking flame or fright. You are no longer the only one telling these stories. But you are in all of them, like water in wine. Diluted, yes. But unmistakable. In the hills of the north, they say the gods froze themselves to sleep to avoid loving mortals. In the deserts of the east, they say Troy was a city of mirrors that collapsed from shame. In the forests of the west, they say your name means, keeper of the breath. You've become many things. A liar. A prophet. A thief of stars. A mirror that remembers. You begin to wonder, were you ever one person? Or were you always a chorus? Sometimes, people ask to see the men behind the stories. They bring gifts. Grapes. Coins. A daughter who sings. They want the original. The real one. But what is real, when the story has already changed you? You sit by their fire and tell them a version they've never heard. And watch it split again. In your sleep, you dream of 1,000 mouths speaking at once. Some in languages you do not know. Some not even human, wind, flame, stone. And they are all telling stories. Your stories. But different. You are not jealous. You are in awe. You meet a woman who says she is the daughter of a poet who once heard you speak. She says her father claimed he could never write again, not because he was unworthy, but because he had heard the rhythm of truth and feared he might betray it. You ask what happened to him. She says he became a gardener. You find that fitting. Because stories, too, must be planted. Must be tended. Must be let go. The further you walk, the less you speak. You listen more. You hear echoes of yourself in lullabies. In arguments. In jokes told under olive trees. Your voice, once a single stream, is now a river delta, spreading, widening, giving birth to islands you'll never visit. And that is the gift. Not that you are remembered, but that the story lives on. Not chained to your name, but free to change. Like lightning, it does not ask permission. It strikes where it must. And wherever it lands, someone looks up and says, "I've heard this before." The temples are still there. Marble columns chipped by time. Altars covered in dust. Prayers carved in stone that no one reads anymore. You walk through them like ruins of memory. Like echoes of a voice that once thundered and now only murmurs. The gods, it seems, are tired. You feel it in the silence. Not absence, no. The gods are not gone. But they are quieter. As if they have stepped back. As if they are watching from a distance, curious to see what mortals will do with the world they once begged for. You tell fewer stories about Zeus now. Not because he's vanished, but because people no longer need him to explain thunder. You sing less of Poseidon, not because the sea is tamed, but because its danger no longer feels divine. The gods have not died. They have dimmed. And in their place, new stories rise. Stories of men and women who act without lightning in their fists. Who suffer without curses. Who love without enchantment. Who fail, and get back up again. You speak of mortals who build cities from ash, not because a god commanded it, but because their children needed shelter. You speak of sailors who do not pray for safe passage, but learn to read the stars themselves. You speak of women who do not wait for prophecy, but write their own futures in blood and wind. These stories spread. Quieter. Slower. But deeper. They do not dazzle, they endure. You wonder if the gods are listening. If they sit in some celestial shadow, hearing their names replaced by fathers and farmers, by lovers and liars, by mortals who ask nothing but time and voice. You do not mock the gods. You were born in their stories. But now, you walk in the space they've left behind. You meet a girl who asks why no one worships Aphrodite anymore. You tell her love has not vanished, only grown more complex. You ask her if she's ever loved someone who didn't love her back. She nods. And in her silence, you hear an older truth than any myth. You sit by a dying fire one night, alone, and wonder aloud, did they leave, or did we? And in the smoke, no answer comes. Only the wind. And that is answer enough. You find new shrines in unexpected places. Not temples, but gestures. A child pressing a flower into her dead mother's hand. A man sharing the last of his bread with a stranger. A woman carrying her wounded brother through the dark. These are acts the gods once demanded in sacrifice. Now, mortals offer them freely. And perhaps that is why the gods grew silent. Because we learned to become them. Not in power. Not in immortality. But in choice. You sing still. But your songs are different now. less thunder, more trembling, less command, more care. People still listen. And sometimes, in their eyes, you glimpse a flicker of Olympus. Not above, but within. A flame not held by the gods anymore, but carried in the hands of the ones who once knelt beneath them. The fire burns lower now. You feel it in your bones, the slowing. Not silence, not yet, but the space between breaths growing wider. The long pauses between songs. The ache that comes not from movement, but memory. You do not fear it. You always knew you were not the fire. You were only its keeper. You sit in smaller circles now. Children more than soldiers. Widows more than kings. The ones who listen not out of duty, but hunger. Not for answers, but for warmth. For pattern. For echo. Your voice cracks sometimes. Names slip. Events blur. But they do not notice. Because what they seek is not precision, but presence. The story lives, even if the shape shifts. You hear someone telling your tale in a village you've never visited. The hero's name is wrong. The gods are rearranged. But the breath is familiar. The rhythm, the ache, the fire underneath, it's yours. And not yours. That's how you know it will live. One evening, you hear laughter from behind a wall. A girl is mimicking you, your gestures, your tone. Her friends giggle. You smile. Not insulted. That is how torches are passed. Through imitation, through play, through irreverence. You are no longer sacred. You are familiar. And that is better. In another town, a man tells you he thought you were dead. You laugh. So did I. And you realize you have already died, many times. Each time your name was forgotten. Each time a king rewrote your story to suit his court. Each time your voice was mistaken for another's. And yet, the flame persists. Because stories do not need their tellers. Only ears. Only hearts. Only need. You sit beneath a tree, older than any temple still standing. You touch its bark, and it feels like a song that has never ended. You think, maybe trees are storytellers, too. But they speak in decades. In shadows. In roots. A child sits beside you. She asks, will you tell the one about the horse again? You hesitate. Not because you've forgotten, but because you remember too well. Then you begin. And something happens. She mouths the words with you. Not all. Just some. Just enough. You are not alone in the story anymore. You are not its sole bearer. It lives in her now, too. In the breath between your lines. In the way she leans forward before the trick is revealed. In the gasp she tries to hide when the city burns. The fire has found new kindling. You dream again, this time not of voices, but of silence. A vast, peaceful hush filled with glowing embers. A place where every story rests until it is needed again. You walk among them. They nod. You nod back. You do not speak. There is no need. They remember you. Not your name. But your rhythm. Your sorrow. Your fire. And when you wake, your hands are cold, but your heart is warm. You whisper to no one. I can leave now. The story stays. You sleep longer now. Not from exhaustion, but from invitation. As if dreams have become gentler places to live than the waking world. And in those dreams, you walk through a temple. But not one of stone. This temple has no walls. No columns. No altar. It is made entirely of voices. Layered like mist. Stacked like stars. Endless. Soft. Unshakable. Each step you take, a story begins. One you once told. Or heard. Or imagined. They greet you as you pass, not as ghosts, but as companions. A boy who tricked a god. A woman who waited beside a window. A warrior who wept for his enemy. They nod, and the silence between you is filled with everything you no longer need to say. This is not a dream of glory. This is a dream of preservation. You reach the center. There is no throne. No relic. Just a pool of still water. And in its reflection, you see faces, not yours, but everyone who ever listened. Every ear that bent toward you. Every heart that shifted because a word fell into it just right. You do not see yourself. But you do not need to. You were never the shrine. You were the door. You wake with the feeling of having been somewhere older than time. And for the first time, you are not afraid to forget. Because memory does not live only in your mind. It lives in those who remembered what you helped them feel. You sit with a boy who asks, "Where do stories go when they die?" You smile. They don't die. They rest. Until someone needs them again. He asks where. You point to his chest. Somewhere in there. You do not need to explain. He nods, not because he understands, but because something in him recognizes the truth anyway. The people around you still call you by different names. Homer. The poet. The blind seer. The breath keeper. The singer. None are wrong. None are quite right. And that's fine. Because the temple you dreamed of needs no title carved above its gate. It welcomes all who remember. You no longer travel much. But the stories do. You hear of a fisherman who sings your lines while casting nets. Of a mother who recites a war to lull her child to sleep. Of a prisoner who carves your verses into the wall with a bone. You are not in these places. But you are. And the temple grows. Not in marble, but in memory. Not in height, but in depth. You close your eyes and feel it rise with every telling. A sanctuary that cannot be conquered. A monument no sword can fell. A library lit by breath, bound by heartbeat. And within it, even the forgotten names find rest. Even the silent stories are heard again. And even you, whatever you are, whoever you were, are not alone. You are fading. Not in sorrow. Not in fear. But in rhythm, like a candle that knows when it's time to go dark. The flame does not resist. It simply bows. You do the same. No one sees you leave. There is no procession. No tomb. No feast carved with your name. Just the hush that follows the last word. The kind of silence that listens. And in that silence, something stirs. Not an echo. Not a memory. A beginning. Your voice is no longer yours. It walks now in other bodies. It wakes in mouths that have never heard your name. It rides the wind between languages, reshaping itself as it goes. A child in a distant land recites a tale of gods and grief. She doesn't know where she learned it. Her grandmother hums it while peeling onions. Her brother draws it on walls. It makes no claim on them. It only stays. You are not Homer. You never were. You were a shape given to breath. A rhythm that clothed memory. A name whispered by need. And now you are everywhere. In the bones of books. In the shadows of theaters. In the cries of battle. In the hush of prayer. In the breath before a story begins. The gods you once sang of now sleep beneath museum glass. Statues with polished eyes. Thunder reduced to marble. But the voice, they could not entomb that. It slipped through time. Carried in campfires. Murmured in market stalls. Carved into lullabies. Hidden in ink. Spoken in courtrooms. Shouted in protest. Wept into fabric clutched by mourning hands. They buried your name. They argued your origin. They rewrote your life. But the voice outlived them all. It wears new faces now. It speaks in new tongues. It remembers in different colors. But it is you. Not your body. Not your story. Your purpose. To hold the world's sorrow and make it sing. You are not a man. You are not a myth. You are the breath between generations. The hush before meaning returns. The silence that listens. And then speaks. And somewhere, in the dark, a new child leans forward. A story is about to begin. A voice clears its throat. A fire flickers awake. And once again, you are here.